Greetings and welcome to Lucas Brews. In this video, I build and review the Hasegawa 1/72nd scale F111G Aardvark from the Royal Australian Air Force. Despite the reprinted instructions, the decals are only for Australian aircraft in this kit. I chose to do the Boneyard Wrangler, which is an aircraft I'll talk about after I've built it. The kit itself is pretty decent, and the details are very good. The mould was clean of flashing, and there were no injector pins, and the clear parts were also well done. Sadly, the all-important wings were not designed to be variable and swept back as the real aircraft's wings were. However, the flaps and slats could be modelled in the open or closed position. Assembly begins with the cockpit and the front wheel well. The nose section comes in two halves, with the cockpit as a unit that slots on top of the wheel well and then in between the nose halves. After a bit of cleanup, I put all the pieces together for the cockpit. The details were basic but still nicely moulded, with no flash or injector pins. I added detail by using a pin to drill in buttons, bending some thin necklace wire to make ejection handles and throttles, and I also cut some polystyrene sheets to make raised details such as buttons, and I made a display for the PaveTac laser infrared guidance system out of some spare sprue and some styrene sheets. While the main cockpit assembly dried, I'd built the wheel well. The details were pretty decent for these, especially for the main wheel well, which I do later. I make the ejection handles by bending copper wire into a hoop shape and then gluing it to the side walls. For the throttles, I simply bent them to make an L shape and stuck them in the pedestal and between the crew. I also added a tiny bit of raised detail with some polystyrene for the main panel. Here you can see me using a knife to attach the fine details that I made, such as the buttons, using a little bit of Revell Contactor Professional and a knife. And here you can see me adding in details such as circuit breakers and buttons using a small pin on the back walls. They were pretty empty, and if I looked at reference photos I found there was a lot more detail to be added. The interior was painted RLM grey in two watered down coats before the finer details and washes were added. There were some small details on the sidewalls for the cockpit halves too, so I painted those. With the first coat dry, I add the second coat. It's always better to do two thin layers of paint than one thick sloppy one that hides all of your details and nice work. Because I chose to add in the PaveTac display to the front panel, I had to cut the old decal's radar screen off using a pair of sharp scissors. With the final layer of RLM grey completed and dried, I added on finer details. I began with flat black for the panels, joystick and the seat. The Aussie F111s were famous for having a sheepskin cover on the seats, which was added for comfort, which is why I chose that colour for the seats. Other details that were painted black include the glare shield and the details that were glued onto the canopy later on. I painted the headrests for the seats tank hull red and then moved into yellow for the handles and raised details, using photo references as I went. I also dry brushed the seat belts with flat aluminium before gluing them into the cockpit. Before adding the seats, I did a small panel wash of flat white on the back to get the extra details to pop up. Then I used a fine brush to paint the last of the details. These included a bit of red on the joysticks to add the buttons, black and flat aluminium on the side walls, and also some field grey on the back details such as the thermos and panels, before doing a wet wash of flat black through the entire cockpit and drying the patches and excess with a cotton tip. These flat black washes help give out the detail and also add a tiny bit of weathering. The final step for the cockpit details were to add the decals. I fixed them down with a bit of Tamiya decal adhesive. I then glued the cockpit in place and joined the nose halves together. Naturally, I broke the pitot tube tip off the nose and ended up replacing it later on with some copper wire at the last stage. The engines were painted white and then the blades painted black before they were dry brushed flat aluminium and then given a pin wash. Next came the main wheel bay and the main wheel struts for the F111, which were absolutely flooded with raised details. I painted them initially gloss white and then carefully painted finer details in black, flat aluminium, titanium gold, gloss red, and yellow based on many reference photos I had. After the engines and main wheel bay were glued to the bottom half of the rear fuselage, I joined the nose section up. The wings were never glued in place because I wanted to be able to pose them, even though they needed support from Blu Tack in the end, despite my best efforts to get the aircraft's wings to be able to be moved while being attached. The upper section was joined, and then the wings and horizontal stabilizers were test fitted. While everything dried, I painted the engines on the sprue using titanium gold. I would later tone them down very heavily with a flat black wash. Additional details such as the air intakes, air brake, tail skids, antenna and bits were added before painting the aircraft. I painted the aircraft in 4 watered down coats of German grey using my regular technique to get a smooth and realistic finish. I do this by watering down each layer so that they're very thin and applying them in the direction of the airflow. Over time you build up layers and end up with a nice, smooth and uniform layer of paint. I enjoy using the acrylics because they're easy to work with and even easier to clean. With this technique, the key is to be incredibly patient and not expect to be able to paint the entire aircraft in one layer. As for the consistency for the paint, it's not really based on a formula but more the feel of the paint. You don't want it to be washing too much into the panel lines and leaving completely nothing on the surface, but you don't want it to be too thick and gloopy. Ideally, the paint should be just slightly see-through on each layer. After the final layer of German grey had dried, I painted the nose cone and the glare shield flat black using a slightly fine brush and making sure to carefully follow the engraved panel lines. I cut out the side hatches on the canopy frame very carefully using a sharp knife, and then I painted the canopy after gluing it onto the aircraft. I painted the wheels while they were still on the sprue, using flat white for the rims and then flat black for the rubber. I put the exhaust system together, which I thought was pretty nicely detailed, and then left it aside while I finished off the wheels. I glued the wheels together and then attached them to the aircraft before giving them a slight neaten up. It's no big deal if you make a tiny bit of a mess on your first few goes with the wheels. You can easily fix up the details later. I painted a silver section on the exhaust based on reference photos once they had dried, and then painted the fuel dump mechanism section on the fuselage of the aircraft. Flat black made yet another epic return when I neatened up the wheels in between doing the exhausts and the fuel dump, and also when I did another coat on the nose to make sure it was nice and smooth. I also then painted fine details on the wings and surfaces that were painted black. The engine exhausts and the fuel dump system received 2 coats of very thin watered down flat black, almost to a pinwash level. This was to get the darker realistic colour of the exhausts while retaining some of the metallic effect. Additional washes were added to the wheels and some of the exhaust systems on the aircraft before moving on to the decals. Once the aircraft was prepared, I added on the decals. They were of a very decent quality with only a tiny bit of silvering on the large, thick wing walkway markings. I had to take a lot of care with the thin walkway decals as well, since they were very fragile and I ripped several and had to carefully rejoin them. Unfortunately, due to their size, the wing decals didn't dry very well. I'd recommend either painting them manually if you can mask it, or possibly even cutting out the black walk lines from the main decal. After applying the decals, I add a coat of Tamiya decal adhesive to help them conform to the surface by flowing into the recessed panels, and also to act as an adhesive to make sure they last longer. I attempted to rub the larger decals on the wings with a cotton bud to help them adhere to the surface, which mainly worked. After leaving the decals overnight to dry, I moved on to the weathering process. I used a very fine brush to stipple flat aluminium along the leading edges of the wing, the horizontal stabilizers, the vertical stabilizer, and also along the recessed panels, especially the maintenance doors around the canopy, the walkways, and also the areas that would receive wear and tear such as the fuel caps. When weathering, I try to keep to the areas that would be exposed to the airflow and bits of debris when flying through the air, and also the areas where maintenance crews would mostly be working on and possibly bumping and scratching the paint off. I was very pleased with the final results and how the details popped up thanks to the weathering. However, I probably overdid it slightly, given that despite the age of the F-111s in the Royal Australian Air Force, they were very carefully looked after. The final step for weathering was to do grime and streaks. Based on reference photos of the Boneyard Wrangler, towards the end of its service, it had a very heavily discoloured tail surface with large black streaks that almost look like leaks. I simulated these by painting heavily watered down flat black on the tail and rubbing it slightly with a cotton tip in the direction of the airflow to produce the streaky, dirty effect. I used this technique also on the control surfaces and the various access ports, especially on the fuel caps and possibly oil access panels around the engines and the nacelles. With the final weathering completed, I replaced the pitot tube, added the landing lights, and with that, the model was finally completed. Building this kit was a lot of fun and brought back a lot of childhood memories for me of the dump and burns and river fire displays, as well as the thrilling low-level passes the F-111 was famous for. The Boneyard Wrangler as an aircraft alone also has a fascinating story. It was an ex-nuclear F-111 purchased by Australia second-hand from the US Air Force in the late 90s, and had to be restored by the famous Boneyard team, hence where it got the name Boneyard Wrangler from. Because of my volunteer work at the wonderful Queensland Air Museum, not only did I get this model kit from their shop at a slight discount, but I was also privileged enough to talk to the pilot who flew it across the Pacific from the States, Air Vice Marshal Dave Dunlop, who works at QAM now as a tour guide. Getting to know him and the history of what you are building always makes the experience much more fascinating. As a result of my biases, I would certainly say this is a great kit, and also thanks to its good details and quality, great fit, and despite its almost unforgivable lack of moving wing sweep, it's still a great kit and I would highly recommend it for anyone who's interested in the F-111. Thanks very much for watching Lucas Brews. If you're enjoying our videos, please leave a like or comment, and don't forget to subscribe. A shout out to our wonderful Patreon, Archie, a true legend who has been helping the channel out for a long time. We also have some fresh aircraft cleaning time-lapse videos from the Queensland Air Museum on the way, as well as some more build videos and possibly some animations in the future, so stay tuned for that, and as always, model on!